Thank you, Aaron. And can everybody hear me okay? Microphone's working on great. Well, first I'd like to thank Aaron for the kind introduction, as well as C2ST for the invitation to come and speak about something that I'm very passionate about and something that I enjoy speaking about. And so in order to get started here, I think this pretty much shows it. There is not a day that goes by that I see when you don't find something in the newspaper or something on TV or something on radio that makes some reference to the safety of our food supply. First one day you hear, yeah, this is safe. Something you hear another day, this isn't safe, this is good for you, this isn't good for you. And so in many cases, what the consumers tend to do is just tune it out in many cases. And that's a mistake, because that can cause problems down the line. The truth is, you really need to become aware of what food safety is, what you can do to protect yourself, and really the good news is what's going on in the food system that actually is built to protect the food supply for you. So before I get started here, one of the questions you ask, well, what is foodborne illness and what is food poisoning? Well, everybody thinks that that's what it is. And it is. But that's not all. That's the part that most people think about. Okay, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to have a less than fun time in the bathroom for a day or two, and then I'm going to be fine. And if that's all that you get, you're right. You are lucky. Because this happens to be the Gerber family in 1924, and there were 12 people in this family that consumed home canned string beans. Every one of them died from botulism. It's interesting, the logo that was put up, the very first one, had sausages. And this organism that causes this Clostridium botulinum, the botulinum is related to the Latin word botulus, which is sausage. And botulism used to be called sausage disease. So it's quite appropriate that they had put sausages up there. So this is a very serious form of foodborne illness. Fortunately, we don't see much of this in the United States anymore. It's probably less than several dozen. In many cases, home canned foods, or it may be acquired in some other way, foodborne. So Aaron already mentioned this about these statistics, 48 million cases. So really that's 1 in 6. So if you count off 1 in 6 of you as you go through, you're not the lucky one. One in 6 people are going to get foodborne illness every year. About 250,000 will become hospitalized, which is no fun, and about 3,000 die. And this makes this a very serious public health problem. And we were talking earlier before this about it's important, how these statistics are even arrived at, because these are estimates. And the reason they're estimates is that if you look at the total number of cases that are actually identified by a physician, sent to the public health agencies, and then confirmed by CDC, it's probably only 1 in 10 of these. And the problem is that when people do get sick, they don't report it. When they think there's a restaurant involved, they don't report it to the public health authorities in the area. When they're sick at home, they don't bother going to the doctor. When they go to the doctor, they don't bother taking cultures. And so we really have a very big underreporting of foodborne illness in this country, and even worse, globally. And the information about why this is so important is that, and I'll say more about this a little bit later, is that we find that what we call immunocompromised individuals are especially at risk for the worst effects, which is permanent illness or death. And some of these people are ones that are loved ones who are the ones that need the most protection. These are children, and these are our elderly population. These are people who are on some sort of medication. As I said, I'll say more about that a little bit later, because it really shows how things are changing in this country. And going back to that first slide showing what is food poisoning, it is more than just a stomach ache. We've learned over the last 10 or 20 years that when someone gets a foodborne illness, it sometimes triggers another after effect in the individual called reactive arthritis, which is really an inflammation in the joints, and sometimes this is permanent. It will last the rest of your life. So you'll be sick and you'll be throwing up for a couple days, but then wonder why you have these other problems with inflammatory disease that last forever. And in some cases, the effects of these inflammatory diseases that come after the foodborne illness are worse and cost, in terms of economic impact, more than the illnesses did in the first place. So it is important to pay attention to these things. So why have we seen this, and why does this even happen? We've had foodborne illness around forever, for as long as there were food. In fact, that's how, probably our ancestors learned which foods not to eat and which ones to eat. If you saw someone eat something and they died, don't eat that. But quite often, it may not be every time. It may be only 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 of cases where that would happen. But we seem to see more foodborne illness in recent years, in the past decade or so. So why is that? Well, this is the good news, is that we are able to recognize these outbreaks in these cases much better than we were even 10 or 20 years ago. The surveillance system is improving, both locally as well as with our federal agencies, such as the Centers for Disease Control. We now have access to genetic fingerprinting. Now, why is that important? Well, we can now show that if you find a culture in a food and you isolate a culture from a patient and they're exactly the same, you've got a smoking gun there. And so you know what caused it. So that's part of it too. And we have better epidemiology, that we have better ways of relating an illness to a food or to an outbreak. And one of the things that has influenced this, oddly enough, is the very thing that we're using tonight for streaming this lecture, which is the internet. This has enabled the epidemiologists and the public health departments in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world, to compare quickly in real time whether a culture taken from, let's say, spinach in Wisconsin is exactly the same one that happened in Oregon. And you may remember the outbreak that we had with bagged spinach back in about 15 years ago now. So that's how they found this out, and that was really the first time that this happened. So we do have better science, and that's good news, and will continue to improve. And in some ways, this can be sort of a detriment because people say, well, we're finding more foodborne illness. Well, yeah, we're looking for more foodborne illness. The science that's involved in this is sort of like going into your basement and turning on the light. You do that, sometimes you wish you hadn't because it wasn't what you thought it was when the lights were off. And that's true with foods as well. We also see now that the world is changing, and this is a really big impact on foodborne illness. We are now seeing products from different parts of the world that we would have never thought of importing. And it's not just our close neighbors, although they're important, Canada and Mexico, but we're seeing this come from both developed countries overseas, developing countries, some of which don't have such great food safety systems. And then they're coming into our country. Now, the regulatory agencies, USDA and FDA, expect that products coming from foreign countries meet the exact same standards that we have in this country. But when you look at the volume of product that's coming from foreign countries, there is no way that they can actually analyze or look for that. They have to look, again, at preventive measures, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment as well. We're also seeing the importance of transportation. So not only are products being produced in different parts of the world, or even within this different country, they can reach your plate in a matter of hours. Whereas maybe 50 years ago, you may have to take a slow boat from another country, or you may have had to truck a product across the country or from Mexico that took days. And then during that time, perhaps we could have analyzed it and found out there was a pathogen. Now you can literally go into another country, harvest it that morning, and have it in somebody's plate on a restaurant in Chicago that very evening. So there's really not much time or much room for error in that case. And this is the part I was referring to also with respect to immunocompromised public. We are seeing the demographics in this country changing dramatically. As a country, and really with many developing countries, we are becoming older as a population. That all by itself has the potential for making you more susceptible to foodborne illness. Now, as you become older, you do some other things. You usually have more chronic diseases, arthritis or heart disease or high blood pressure or diabetes. All of these will require medications that have been good in extending the life, But some of these medications likewise make you more susceptible to the worst effects of foodborne illness. So that increases the risk. And then, as I said, we've got, including chemotherapy and surgery, transplants. Then, as I mentioned before, some of our loved ones, such as the youngest among us, and also pregnant women, tend to be more at risk. And so we really are looking at a different philosophy on who to protect. When I first was in college and one was looking at food safety policy and food safety law, they were basically based on the average person. Now, the average person back then was a good, healthy 20-year-old male. That is not the face of our public today, which is if you are over the age of, I'll say 50, if you're taking any kind of medication for chronic illness, if you have had any other kind of illness related that may weaken your immune system, there's not many people in this room that don't have one of those predisposing conditions. So that's why we have to do a better job of making sure we prevent the illness in the first place. We're also seeing other changes in society kind of related to the import and export of foods, but we're also seeing the dynamics with new cultures moving into the country where we are seeing different foods in this country than we have seen before. When I grew up, I would have never heard of sushi. And now you can't even go to a gas station without seeing sushi in the, at least on the menu. But how many of you ever heard of mamey? Mamey, a fruit called mamey. I'll tell you, it's a fruit. It is a Caribbean fruit, primarily eaten in Jamaica and Haiti. And so it doesn't get a lot of attention here now, but it was actually the source of a very large typhoid outbreak a number of years ago because the product was produced in one of these other foreign countries, came to Miami and was used primarily among the Caribbean population there. But when the Food and Drug Administration went to look and see what happened, they found this stuff and said, "What is this?" I said, "Well, it's mamey." They had no idea how to analyze for it because they had never seen it before. And more this occurs as we see different cultures emigrating to the United States and bringing their customary foods with them. In some cases, they may have known how to prepare them in their homeland, but when some modern American comes and tries to cook it, perhaps it doesn't work quite so well, and they're not as careful and do not know how to prepare it. So as a society and really as a public, what can we do to prevent foodborne illness? What can we do to stop foodborne illness? I don't think that we'll ever completely stop it, but we have a number of things that we can do to help. One of which I mentioned earlier is better surveillance. And that is being able to identify which pathogen, which organism is mostly associated with which food. Now, why is this important? Because right now, and in the past, we've had sort of a shotgun approach. We look at salmonella and well, how many cases of salmonella are there? Well, there's millions, several million a year of salmonellosis. But where do they come from? Chicken? That was the assumption. Well, now we're seeing as our science gets better, it's not just chicken. It's cantaloupe. It's tomatoes, it's beef, it's all over. And so the regulatory agencies with their limited budget have to figure out where am I going to focus my preventive actions? Well, you can't do everything. So it's important to be able to identify and have an attribution of where this organism is coming from for most of the time so that you can focus your resources there better, either in terms of regulatory actions against the companies that are making this or in terms of finding better controls to prevent them from getting becoming contaminated. Again, we're talking a bit about genetic fingerprinting. The newest technology that you're seeing using is what's known as next generation sequencing, in which you can quickly be able to sequence or identify all of the entire genome of these pathogens. Very important. You use that as a fingerprint now and match. This is becoming so, the resolution on this is so good that the regulatory agencies are now being able not to just say, oh, this is a salmonella or this is a listeria, but this is a salmonella and we've seen this before and it seems to come out of the southern part of California and it seems to have always been associated with, I don't know, cilantro or parsley. They can then automatically send the investigators to that and be able to make more quickly an identification of what's going on there. Now, in past years, and not that many years ago, 5 or 10 years ago, this whole genome sequence would have taken several weeks and probably cost several $100,000 to do it. We can now do this in a matter of a few hours for under $100. So it's becoming much more practical. And I'll point to this one on the bottom, this photograph. That is the future of whole genome sequencing, having sequencers that are the size of a deck of cards that would be able to do a sequence in real time for a few dollars. So that is coming. We also have changes in regulatory philosophy, which is something we've done. Many of you may have heard that several years ago, Congress passed a new law, but it was also an additional law for most products, for FDA-regulated products, which is everything but meats, poultry, and some eggs, called the Food Safety Modernization Act. This was a complete change in the way that regulatory activities would work. In the past, FDA would have regulations, and they were what we called command and control. They would say, if you're going to sell milk, you have to take that milk, you have to pasteurize it at this temperature, you have to hold it for this many seconds, you have to have it in this kind of equipment that has stainless steel that is of a specific grade. Well, that became difficult, and the other thing it did is that sort of prevented innovation. I mean, you knew exactly what you had to do, and it wasn't really working that well for most types of foods. So the philosophy has changed with science to say, you know, rather than telling the industry exactly how to do it, let's just say, here is the standard you need to meet. I don't care how you do it, but get to that standard. Well, now all sorts of innovative new technologies are being developed to meet that need. The other part of it is we don't want to have to go chasing down foods to try to do testing to see if it has a harmful organism. We want you, the industry, who are the best, who know the best on how to make safe food, tell us what you think are the most likely hazards that are likely to occur, and we want you to plan ahead and try to figure out how you're going to prevent that from being in the food in the first place. So this is where terms that are new to the food industry, such as preventive controls, these are new technologies that will prevent the organism getting there, are now going to be expected. And this is going to change the way that the food industry produces food and that they are regulated compared to what they have in the past. I mentioned a moment ago that sort of what we want to encourage are new ways of producing foods and making them safer. But as a consumer, I don't want it to taste like cardboard either, and I don't want it overcooked. I want really good quality, and I want it to be safe, and so do others. So if you look at what consumers are expecting now, there is a need for innovation and new processing technologies and new manufacturing procedures. People want food that is safe. They want it to be fresh or fresh-like. For instance, many people are shying away from canned beans or canned corn, commercially canned. They're very safe, very nutritious, but people don't like it when it's overcooked. They want it more like fresh. They want it to have sensory qualities, and as you can see from the food networks that are being watched in greater numbers, people are really interested in making better food and getting back to basics and more interested in culinary. But you also have to realize that we're not going to be able to grow lettuce in the area around Chicago for much part of the year. So we still have to be able to get it from where it is grown. Perhaps it would be in Chicago, inside a building, in hydroponics, and that is being done down the future. But there's still a need for shelf life, being able to hold it in your refrigerator. We as a society are not going to go grocery shopping every other day like they do in some developing countries, or every day. And improve functionality. That means that it works the way it's supposed to, that it has the nutritional content, which is the whole reason we're supposed to be eating foods, that is expected of it, and the retention of the bioactivities of those nutrients in it so that they don't just go away. Now, this is where the limits of our technologies, which have been very good, they have really given the Americans a very abundant food supply. In fact, some would say too abundant because we're gaining weight as a society, but of relatively safe food. In general, our American food supply is very safe. However, such as canning, I mentioned that a moment ago, people don't want the deterioration of color. They want their beans bright and green. They don't want them sort of olive coloring. They don't want it overcooked so that the nutrients have been damaged. They want to be able, they're much more aware of nutritional health. And some fresh foods just aren't suitable for canning like that. The only way that you're going to get them is either raw or some other way. So we have, in the last 20 years or so, new technologies that have been designed towards this end. This is a partial list of some of the technologies that we are seeing and that you will be seeing. This includes ionizing radiation. Now, this you've heard before about radiated food. It's a great technology for food safety. Consumers still don't want to accept it, and many don't, but it still is there, and it's being used in different ways than perhaps we thought of using it 10 years ago. Everybody has a microwave oven in their home, but now we're talking about microwave ovens that can be used to process food. So you'll be talking about a microwave oven half the size of this room, where it can, commercial scale, can actually be used to eliminate the pathogens in products such as, say, flour or spices. We have ultraviolet light. Now, ultraviolet light by itself, the same one that gives you sunburn in the summer, can also be used to pasteurize different products. Now, it has to have exposure to the light, and in some cases it might be just ultraviolet light. In some cases it may be, and I don't have it on here, what's called high intensity light, white light. And it flashes, and there's so much energy involved in it that you can actually kill the pathogenic bacteria on the products if it happens to be in a thin layer. This is going to be a technology that would work for something like spices, where you don't want to heat it up because you drive all of the flavor and odors that you want with spices away, but you still don't want to have the pathogens there. Pulse electric field, where you actually put ends of electrodes and you pass current through something like a soup, where you can actually kill the microorganisms using that technique. Cool plasma, which is, you can see it on the left-hand photograph, kind of looks like lightning, kind of is. It's not hot, it's not like fire, even though it looks like fire. It really is a transmission of energy into the food, again, for such things as nuts, which have become a problem for food safety too, and grains. And then one high pressure processing, which is probably the most commercially viable of the technologies that I've mentioned here, and one that's already in use and will continue in use for certain foods. So I'll focus a little bit more on that particular one. When I'm talking about high pressure, I'm talking about high pressure. It is, you put a food into a cylinder, and if you look at the area there, the size of a standard DVD or CD player that you might have, and in there, if you were to put 200 elephants squashing on that, that's the kind of pressure that this product gets. And it has the advantage that even though it sounds like it's harsh, and it is, especially to the bacteria that are being exploded inside that food, not to hurt us, but it doesn't have the same quality defects that you would have with heating. So for something like juice, you have a way that you can process the juice with this. It doesn't have the same heating intensity that normal pasteurization does. So you have a juice that's very fresh-like, and consumers really like this, but it's safe. And so we're seeing that with a variety of other foods as well. Here's another use for that. Raw oysters. Raw oysters are unfortunately a high-risk food because of the pathogens that are in them. So what has been developed are this high pressure that kills these bacteria in the raw oysters. They keep sort of their same sensory qualities for people that like that. They also help the oyster open up so they're easier shucking. So it's a technology that is being encouraged, especially in certain parts of the country, especially in the Gulf Coast region where many of the oysters may have a certain pathogen known as Vibrio. Here's another case. This is sliced deli meat, and then we have another ham there. Many of you may have heard of the organism Listeria monocytogenes. The last time you heard about this was with respect to cantaloupe about 2 years ago, where it was one of the largest fatalities of a foodborne outbreak that we've had. This organism is unique compared to other ones in that it grows at refrigeration temperature. So even if you have a product and refrigerate it, it still grows on there. And this is one that hits, again, the young, the pregnant, and the older people. So it used to be that it was deli meats that were the biggest source of this. We didn't hear about this. We heard about it in cantaloupe. We haven't heard about it in deli meats. So one of the solutions is actually to take the sliced deli meats, put them in a package, put them under high pressure, kill the listeria, and now it's sealed up until it gets home to the consumer and is in a safe mode. So it's virtually eliminated listeria from some of these processed deli meats. And here's another one, other horticulture products. Guacamole is one probably that most people are familiar. If you go to the refrigerated section of a grocery store, you'll see guacamole in the refrigerated area, bright green. This was something that would not have been available 20 years ago or so. You make guacamole fresh, and then it lasts about 3 hours, and by that time it's turned all sort of yucky brown, and nobody wants to eat it. Well, here's a way to talk about shelf life where it will last a number of weeks, at least until you open it and expose it to oxygen, and you can have a product that many people didn't have access to before, and you don't have to buy avocados and go make it fresh, although I got it, to my mind, it's still better that way, but you have to eat it quickly. And as I mentioned, juices. You will see more and more juices, fresh-like juices, that are being used using high pressure processing as opposed to traditional pasteurization. So what does all of this have to do, and we're here at the Chicago Council of Science and Technology, what does this all have to do with Chicago? Well, a couple things. Chicago, many people don't realize, has a history of the food industry. Chicago was the birthplace of the meat and poultry industry, slaughtering industry many years ago. Some of this was built on the strengths that we had in Chicago. We had a fantastic transportation system. We had a great number of workers that immigrated here and worked in it. We are right next door to the agriculture areas that produce it, and we're right in the middle of the country, so we can distribute to the rest of the country. People sort of lost focus that this was actually, that Chicago was this hub of food activity until we had some bad news, which was a book that was written early in the 20s that sort of showed how some of the bad practices didn't work. And so The Jungle was actually fiction, but it was based on some things that actually did happen on the south side of Chicago, right near my university, right across the street in the stockyards. But even though there were these horrible things that happened, and this book, which was really not meant to stimulate interest in food safety, it did. It was because of this book that the Food and Drug Act was actually written back in the early part of the 20th century and brings us to where we are today. So it ended up being good for us today. But we still have some assets in Chicago and in the Chicago region that are still here just like they were 150 years ago, but people have forgotten about them, that Chicago really still is the core. It is still the center of gravity for the food and agriculture industry in this country. If you think of the other cities that have a lot of food processing, you have Minneapolis, you have Battle Creek, you have Omaha, we're the bullseye. So why do I say this? I say this because I'm trying to promote interest that we really do have some assets here too, including a university that focuses on food safety and the technologies that can help rebuild and re-energize the food industry, not just in Chicago and globally. So conclude here by saying, before I bring up Eric, and there's one of those universities buildings right there, that food safety is and will still be an important public health issue that we'll need to deal with in the future. The good news is that the food system is improving the safety of foods. Our surveillance system is getting better at improving the foods. And the good news is Chicago is a leader in this area and will continue to be a leader. So with that, I will end and let my colleague, Eric Larson, come up and speak.
Let me just do a sound check. Can people hear me? Okay, great. So that was great to hear Bob talk. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. As you heard in the in the introduction about my background, I am a trustee at Illinois Institute of Technology, and I'm also chairman of the board of overseers for the Institute for Food Safety and Health. So Bob and I work closely together, and I'm delighted to join him tonight in being up here. We are fortunate to have Dr. Brackett here working with us. He has brought a vision to Chicago about what we can do in what he calls the global business of food. So you heard the science from Bob. As I was preparing my remarks, I thought I would explore a little bit more of the history of food safety and why it's important today. So let me just touch on some of the topics that I'd like to talk about. I'm going to tie history, a little bit of ironic history of Illinois Institute of Technology and how it was founded and how it is connected to the food industry. I'll give you a little of my own background, why I'm interested in food. I am a professional investor. I'm not out of the food industry, but I do think I have a connection to food. I've had a connection to food for my whole life. I would like to share with you a brief history of food safety in America. It goes back farther than you might think, and so I'll share some of my research on that, or some of my findings on that. And then what I really want to talk about tonight is the fact that food safety is a shared responsibility. We rely heavily on the government to do this, but there are other parties, including consumers, who play a very important role in the shared responsibility of food safety. And then if you haven't already expanded your definition of what it means for safe foods, I'd like to describe with you how we're working on an alternative or an expanded definition of safe foods, which is foods that are safe for your body to eat, that promote health in your body. And then lastly, why this is important. I'll build off of some of the comments that Bob had, why it's important to the Chicago area and why it is important globally. So here's the takeaway message. You can leave after I finish these if you'd like. The takeaway messages I'd like you to have is there is a very long history in food safety. I'll take you back to 1862 when it starts. I want to describe the shared responsibility between the government, who plays the leading role here, the FDA, the USDA, the Centers for Disease Control, among others, but the other responsibilities that come from academics, from the food industry, and in particular from consumers. And then I will give you a little of my description or definition of our definition of what safe food means, which is the promotion of health. And there's some research that's being done at iFish about that. In other words, our clean fuel for our bodies. And then the role that the Midwest and IIT in particular play. So the history of the connection of IIT to food safety goes back to the early 1890s in what was called the $1 Million Sermon. Some of you may have heard this. This is the founding of IIT. The pastor and the meat packer. So this fellow on the left, Pastor Frank Gonzalez, was the minister of the Plymouth Congregational Church. In one of his sermons, he claimed that for $1 million, he could build a school that would be open to students of all backgrounds instead of just people who were elite. And to put it in context, that would be $25 million today. The fellow on the left is Philip Danforth Armour, and he was sitting in the congregation that day. And he went up to the pastor afterwards and he said, "If you're serious about that, come by my office tomorrow and I will write you a check for $1 million." That was the founding of the Armour Institute, which has become IIT. And so I think there's just a nice irony here that food safety at IIT has a very long history going back to Philip Armour. Here's one of the Armour plants. And if you haven't been on the IIT campus, this is the historic old building of the Armour Institute. So let me briefly touch on my background. The reason I've been interested in food my whole life is that I'm a Midwestern farm boy. So I was raised on a farm in Minnesota, and then we still have a farm in Michigan in my family. My parents were both farmers and educators, so they taught me this that I've carried into the business world. They taught me how to grow things from farming, and they taught me about learning from education. When my wife and I moved to Chicago in 1983, I began a career in finance. And I've started 2 investment firms, and I eventually found my way to connect my biology and chemistry undergraduate training to the business world. So we invest in companies that focus on healthcare and life science. And just for indulgence, here's the farm I grew up on. There's me as a little boy on that farm. And I think of myself as going from farm to table. Here's the things that I grow today. So I'm going to take you through, as I said, back to 1862 for the beginnings of food safety. It starts with this man, Charles Weatherill, who was appointed chief chemist for the newly formed U.S. Department of Agriculture by President Abraham Lincoln. And his initial charge, I think, is great. He was asked to look at improvements in the wine industry. Perfect. But he soon began investigating adulteration to agricultural products. And so he was the first person to have that role. One of my heroes of the 19th century is this man, Frederick Law Olmsted, who you probably know as the fellow who created the field of landscape architecture in America. I view him as one of the truly great figures in public health. When President Lincoln became president, he resigned his post as commissioner of Central Park in New York, which he had designed with his partner. He assumed the role of executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was the precursor to the Red Cross. And Lincoln assigned him to go do an evaluation and assessment of the Union troops to find out why they were too weak to fight. And he did his evaluation, and he came back with one short recommendation, which was hire better cooks. The Union troops were undernourished. So he understood one of the definitions of safe food is it meant food that fueled your body. The seminal figure, though, in food safety in the 19th century is this man, Dr. Harvey Wiley. He was trained as a chemist and a medical doctor as well. He took on that post as chief chemist for the government in the early 1880s. And he began a campaign when he took that post to form a consumer protection agency. It took him 25 years to help achieve this Pure Food and Drug Act, which they named in his honor the Wiley Act. This is what they were really looking at. They were concerned about the compounds that were being added to these elixirs. If you look on this particular recipe here, it has morphine, it's got cannabis in it. They were concerned about alcohol, heroin, cocaine, and other additives to these elixirs. I found another one of these little recipes that had as instructions, this product is improved when you add heroin to it. But the story that really grabbed the public's attention is one that Bob talked about. It's set right here in Chicago. The Jungle, if you've read it, you know, is a very sad tale about a young Lithuanian immigrant, Jurgis Rudkus, who comes to work at the Chicago stockyards. And Upton Sinclair's revolting story created a sensation that went all the way to the White House. As the quote says here, Sinclair said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach." So here's what they were looking at. It became a topic on pure food. And Teddy Roosevelt, who was the progressive leader of the progressive movement, made this one of the important acts in his presidency. And that lasted for 30 years. So the next change in food and drug regulation, food, drug, and cosmetic regulation, was in 1938. And again, it was born out of a poisoning tragedy that created an uproar from the public. And so this new law was passed called the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to replace the previous one. Clarence Birdseye was one of those food industry technology innovators who had created a whole line of frozen foods, which was a novel way to serve food at the time. It preserved some of the aspects that Bob talked about previously. And he used this act to get frozen foods recognized and endorsed by the U.S. government, which became an important part of feeding the troops for World War II. So my story continues now, jumps forward 20 years to NASA and Sputnik. What happened when the Soviets put the satellite up in the 50s, we reacted by saying we were going to put men on the moon, they're men in space. And one of the significant constraints that NASA faced was feeding the astronauts. How to provide them proper nutrition, how to do it so that the products were non-refrigerated and non-perishable, and that they were contamination-free. The food safety protocols that were developed for NASA were done with the help of the private sector, as you'll see on the next slide, and they were eventually adopted throughout the food industry without government pressure to do so. So this was a very important step that the food industry brought on itself. So this is the collaboration between NASA, the U.S. Army Research Labs, and Pillsbury Company. They're two notable scientists here, Paul Lachance at NASA and Howard Bauman at Pillsbury, are really the godfathers of this hazard analysis and critical control points process for identifying risks in the food chain, so to speak. They started with these three principles: conduct a hazard analysis, determine critical control points, and establish monitoring procedures. I love this system. It's like the due diligence process that we use when we look at companies. Where are the risk points in the businesses? This is spread throughout the food industry. It became a standard in the early 70s, with Pillsbury as really the leading light in doing that. The next and final act here is what Bob has talked about, the 2011 Food Safety Modernization Act. So think about that, 73 years since the previous legislation was passed by the government, 50-some years since the development of the HACCP principles. This program was begun under the Bush administration, passed under the Obama administration, and had support from both houses of Congress. So a lot has changed about food consumption in the last half century. As we saw earlier, changes in eating habits, more food eaten away from home, global sourcing, 15 to 20% of our food comes from overseas, improvements in detection and tracking of contamination, and then media coverage. So here's the Food Modernization Act, front page of the Food Modernization Act. This is a lot easier to read than the Affordable Care Act. It's three titles, and it addresses how to prevent food contamination, how to react when when you have one, and then what to do to improve quality of foreign foods. So I'm going to move on to this topic on the shared responsibility for food safety. You've seen these statistics already. These come from the Centers for Disease Control. Just a comment on with this improved detection technology, they now have been able to determine that almost any kind of food can harbor pathogens. And there are all 13 new vehicles that were different types of food that we generally consider to be healthy food, spinach, different kinds of nuts, that have been implicated in outbreaks. So we talked a little bit about this already, that the number of outbreaks look like they're increasing. Maybe it's just that the detection and the early warning is happening. Here's a program that was developed by the Centers for Disease Control, where they wanted to monitor and drive down the number of incidents that happened annually. And so they set themselves a target in the mid-90s to drive the incidence of E. coli from 2.5 incidents per 100,000 people down to under 1. And they want to do that in this program they call Healthy People 2010. They achieved their goal ahead of schedule. Now, why is this a problem? There are many places along the food chain, so to speak, where contamination can enter. So you look at this kind of simple graphic here of the different places. Every place there's an arrow or a transition, some sort of contamination can happen. And so we've described that didn't show up very well. That's a Venn diagram that has 4 different constituents there: the government, industry, consumer, and academic research. And what is important to me about the Institute for Food Safety and Health is that the combination of government, industry, and academic research working together has been part of its mission from the beginning, and they do it very effectively. So let's talk a little bit about the government's role. It is in consumer protection as it began back in 1906. Here are the different parties who were actively involved: the Food and Drug Administration, and underneath that it should say the USDA. Those are the regulatory bodies. The non-regulatory surveillance and identifying information and helping make policy comes from the Centers for Disease Control. We've worked with these folks. They are very conscientious and knowledgeable about food safety. There is you may know or you may not know that the FDA has an office co-located at iFish's offices out in just west of Chicago. A couple of years ago, I was at one of our meetings, and the head of the Center for Food Safety and Nutrition, which is part of the FDA, presented these findings. This is a blue ribbon panel of scientists that looked at the mission of the FDA. And they came back with the number one finding out of 15 or 16 in this report was that the FDA did not have the resources to ensure the safety of the U.S. food supply. What that meant was that they couldn't do it alone, and that it required the engagement of the food industry and these other constituents as well. So I have up here this picture of the complexity of the food industry. And as I was doing my work on this, and as I've gotten to know some of the other members through the Institute for Food Safety and Health, I'm impressed by how complex and sophisticated the food industry is, but also the commitment that they have to not only protecting the consumers, but protecting their brands so that they've adopted programs that make the food system safe. So their sense of it is that I think as a result of that, we have a very safe food supply produced by these different companies. Consumers have a role here too, and I think this is maybe one of the weak links in the chain for us. And there's a lot for us to learn about this. It turns out that the foods we like are the same foods that the microbes like. So we need to be careful in how we handle the food. This is a program that the Centers for Disease Control has put together with this nasty little green guy back in the middle. And their recommendation is pretty simple. This is their application of how you make sure your food is safe. They call it the core four, the 4 C's: clean, don't cross-contaminate, cook, and chill. And we used to own a company that made gloves for the food safety industry. It's just something as simple as that. So now I'm going to turn to this other topic on the expanded definition of safe food. So this is my soapbox. If you handle it carefully throughout that food chain, our food is generally free from microbial and chemical contamination. But is it nutritious? Is it healthy? Is it really safe for your body? And I want to talk about 3 examples. I'm here on the medical campus, so it's a little daunting to talk about nutrition and disease here. But let me give 3 examples. One is around malnutrition, the pellagra epidemic of the early 1900s. To continue the discussion around NASA with concentrated nutrition, their Thanksgiving in space that they had. And then a recent example of performance nutrition from the training table of the Seattle Seahawks as they prepared for last year's season on their way to win the Super Bowl. So here's the story on malnutrition. This fellow, Joseph Goldberger, took on this topic of the pellagra epidemic in the southern states in the early 1900s. The prevailing wisdom was that this was some kind of infectious agent that was creating these lesions and making people ill. He believed it was something different than that. He thought that people were malnourished, that they had plenty of calories in their diet, but their diets were making them sick. They were eating cornmeal and molasses, and there were insufficient nutrients, which is what his scientific studies were able to prove. So that was, they had plenty of calories, but the food wasn't necessarily safe for them. We move ahead to concentrated nutrition. When President Kennedy challenged to put a man on the moon, and before that, when President Eisenhower responded to the launch of the Sputnik satellite, it created an ancillary benefit for the food industry. There was research on nutrition, on processes, and on packaging. One of the researchers who worked in this arena said, space travel imposed significant constraints on us. An astronaut who became sick would be a danger to himself and to the mission. And so this was their version of Thanksgiving in space. And you knew it was important because they've created this, what they call the Space Food Hall of Fame. I think it's interesting that M&Ms are on the top of the list here. Here's a guy in space eating M&Ms. And my last slide in this segment is the training table at the Seattle Seahawks, for the Seattle Seahawks. This is from a report I read in August or September of last year. Preseason for the Seahawks. They've changed the way they train. They do meditation and yoga and stuff like that as well. But nutrition is a very important part of what they consider to be safe food, or the way that they train their athletes for high performance. So now Bob has talked a little bit about why this is important to Chicago. We've always been a food town. In the 19th century, our economy was built on grain milling, meat processing, transportation, commodities, and finance. Those are still influences today. And our reputation as a restaurant town is legendary among people who come here for conferences. So it's still a food town. And I am very proud to say, very proud of the role that not only IIT has made to this commitment, but what Bob is doing at the Institute for Food Safety and Health. Since his arrival to become director of this institute, it has been raised inside of Illinois Institute of Technology to a much higher level. And we are delighted to have him here to do that. I'm going to close with a couple comments on why this is important, period. This is in part about feeding the world. And I'd like to just bring up another one of my heroes here, Peter Drucker, who made a couple of predictions toward the end of his life. One of them, when people asked him what one industry he would be involved in, if he could pick one industry for the 21st century, he wanted one that would create enough protein to feed the world. He thought that would be one of the major problems that we face as a nation. The other prediction that he made is that the successful organizations of the 21st century will be those that know how to collaborate outside of their four walls. So to bring this slide back up, so it's not, didn't show very well, but it's this Venn diagram of the shared responsibility between these different constituents of who's responsible for safety, food safety in the country, in the world. And before I close here, I'd just like to show this old man, my dad, on a tractor at 84 years old. As they say, you can take the boy off the farm, but you can't take the farm out of the boy. Thank you.
If the speakers would like to take a seat, we'll do Q&A. We're going to have C2ST staff people with microphones, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and somebody will bring a microphone to you. And they're ready to go, okay?
Thank you. Thank you for your very interesting speeches, but you didn't address a very serious concern of mine. I've been in the healthcare industry now for 50 years, and there's great concern about the use of antibiotics and hormones in the food supplies, in beef, in chicken, some of the hens that lay eggs, and so forth, that are showing that people are getting resistance to antibiotics and dying because it won't heal them when they are given, and also that estrogen in the food supply can cause breast cancer in specific women. One of our pathologists made a study of that, and she feels that there is a direct correlation in some cases.
Do you want to come?
Well, yeah, I think the concern that's been raised about antibiotics has been, this is not new. I mean, this has been going for 20 or 30 years. I think one of the positive parts of that is, and why this has been allowed, is the antibiotics that are used for farm animals are not the same as used for human animals necessarily. But along with that, just even recently, I think there's concern that this shouldn't just apply to foods, that there's an awful lot of misuse in the medical community as well, and that's really happening. Now, one of the things, and this goes back to the importation of food, is, as you know, if you've traveled around, you can buy antibiotics off the shelf in many other countries, and they are used in dramatic amounts. So we can do a good job here too, but if we can't control it in other countries too, we're still going to be exposing our population to antibiotic-resistant organisms, and potentially anyway. The hormones, it depends. I mean, again, they may be using, it's more of a problem in imported products than it is in this country. They're regulated a little bit more strictly here. The hormones, the way they check is look at consumption. Can they find it in the meats at all? In many cases, they can't, even though they might be used. But what's really driving the reduction of these, both the antibiotics and the hormones, is not so much whether the science says that they're a problem or not. It's consumers are just not buying them. And so companies are just taking them out. And so you see a lot of this labeled that way.
Well, I would just add that in looking back over the history of change in food safety, the science alone usually isn't enough to change people. It takes either a change in consumer demand or some sort of public outcry or catastrophe, unfortunately, to get people to change.
But I think we're using it more in America than they're using it in Europe. It's more regulated in Europe.
Oh, yes, that's true. Europe does use a lot less. They have...
And some people in Europe will not eat meat and so forth that comes from America. Mm-hmm. I'm very concerned about chicken and doing the diarrheal. I will not eat certain type of chickens at all.
One of the interesting things about food safety, I think, is that one never really hears about the issues until it hits the consumer. And people get sick, and there's outbreaks of whatever from eating contaminated food. And particularly with your background in the FDA and also your experience, Eric, could you give a perspective on what you see as the current status of food testing in this country, and how you view that, how good or bad you think it is, and then secondly, how you might consider improving it with technology?
Let me take a crack at that? Yeah. Okay. Testing is one of those things that it's evolved over the last probably 20 or 30 years. In the past, under the old sort of philosophy, many in the government and consumers wanted testing of the raw product, but the disease statistics were not showing that was helping at all. So that's what led to what Eric said earlier about this HACCP notion, where, okay, let's not test after the facts, let's put together a hazard analysis, put together some critical control points, which means places where you would stop, so we don't have to do so much testing. We build in the protections up front, and then we don't have to test as much in the back. And that worked to a certain degree. However, that wasn't the total answer. And there's a good reason why that didn't work well, because the used to be, and many of the tests still, took anywhere from a week to a month to get a result. By that time, the food was spoiled and gone already. So what that has done is that's driven the technology to the point where we have a lot better rapid testing, some of which can now get a result in a few hours rather than a few days. So now that that's becoming affordable, more in the industry are finding out, you know what, we really do need to do a lot more testing to make sure that these protections that we put in place actually are working the way that they're supposed to.
But that, yeah, let me just respond to that a little bit. When you do testing, I don't think it's pushed back to where Eric is on the farm, or Eric's family's on the farm. It's not at well, it may be a little bit of the processing area, but you're pushing it back to the supplier way down line, whether it's fish from Chile or wherever. So it's a really tough thing to manage and control, and unless you test every food product that comes in, it's really a sampling error.
And that's one of the trends that's happening in food safety too, is it's actually, and this actually started in Europe more, where the retailers got together and said, we're not going to accept the liability for all this foodborne illness. You, the manufacturer, you prove to us that the food that you're bringing us is safe. So they would set certain specifications, require them to build it. They did the same thing and said, okay, if we've got to do that, we expect our suppliers to meet these same sort of standards. And it is getting pushed all the way back to the farm. And one important result of that has been, for the first time ever, under the Food Safety Modernization Act, there is a produce regulation where it goes right to the farm for such things as water use and what can be added as soil amendments. It is going back to the farm. And the only way you can show that is by testing.
It will be challenging for, this is one of the issues with this, with the law, it will be challenging for a lot of companies, particularly smaller operators, to be able to meet those objectives. If you look at where the FDA has put its priorities, the bill, the Food Safety Modernization Act, is a fairly sweeping legislation, but they're really focused initially on foods coming in from overseas where they're worried about inbound contaminants, and fresh produce.
Well, so leading on that, I saw in one of your slides a lot of interesting equipment, especially the gene testing that you were doing. Mm-hmm. How much of that do you actually do at iFish?
We do some very specific, and that equipment, even right now, is expensive. So you don't want to have a bunch of duplicate equipment that's not being used fully. So we work with the Food and Drug Administration and with our industry partners to sort of divvy up the work to try to figure out who's going to do what work so that we're not having to duplicate and waste money on expensive equipment. We do use it, and I think that as the price comes down, that will become much more routine than it is now. We do, on specific organisms, yep. Specifically on Clostridium botulinum, of all things. Mm-hmm.
I have a two-part question. First one's just definitions on kill. When you use the word kill, what percent are you speaking about? 10 to the 6th, 10 to the 4th, 10 to 2?
Okay. So I thought you meant, because microbiologists have this philosophical argument, when do you know a microorganism is dead? Because sometimes you can process it, put it on a plate, it doesn't grow, but if you had to put it on a different medium, it grows. So is it dead? No, in this case, it kind of depends. That's a performance standard that's used. For something like canned foods, it's 10 to the 12th organisms per gram that has to be killed. It's a 12D process. When you talk about something like juices, it's 5 logs. So 10 to the 5th organisms. And those are based on what is assumed to be a worst case scenario. What is the worst contamination that this product could have a process that will kill that amount.
Okay, great. And the second is a follow-up with this young woman's question on growth hormones and antibiotics. It's not the raw, but my curiosity is if I have a pig or a chicken and then you cook it and it has residual hormones and antibiotics, you're going to get a derivative or a change in the chemistry. And what impact is that having on the food product?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that anybody's really specifically looking at that as much. They're just looking at doing a test for a above threshold amount of a hormone in a product, whether it's beef or chicken, and that's where it stops. So if they can't find an above the normal amount of, for instance, we have a chicken that receives hormones, ones that doesn't. If they're not any different and don't meet some threshold, they say they're both, negative. It's not really negative, it's just below detection.
A couple of questions on cattle-related diseases. I've read in the Wall Street Journal where it's very difficult to really isolate some of these, especially as it relates to the smaller operator, where essentially I guess you have to get down to almost identifying the origin of the cattle in order to be able to identify whether or not it's actually diseased. Related to that is a question I'd have on what degree is the FDA doing with regard to exporting horse meat to Europe, because I know that's been an issue that's recently been in the news. And I guess the third is related to the comment that the primary number one problem with the FDA back when that study was done was the lack of financing. What's been the FDA and the CDC's budget situation the last couple of years? Has it actually expanded, decreased? Did the cutback recently in the government have any impact on the funding of those two agencies?
I'll see if I can keep track of the list of questions here. So I'll run to the resources for FDA and CDC. In the last couple of years, FDA has enjoyed some rather relatively large budget enhancements to meet that. There is no way that they are getting enough resources to actually implement this law. It's just without having to have either either appropriated funds or as they have proposed using with so-called user fees. That is, if you have a food industry, that a company has to pay a fee in order to help do that. So what will happen is they just won't implement those parts of the law that they can't afford to do. And of course, then they'll get sued and expected to do it anyway, as they've had in terms of the implementation. CDC is in the same position. Now, with respect to the amount of resources increases they've recently got, maybe that gets them back to where they would have been 10 years ago had they just had a cost of living increase during that time. So the way the federal budgets work is unfortunate. It's feast or famine. They get about the first year, and then they get starved for a couple of years. Then they go back up and get their allocation and go back down. It's not the most efficient way to build a public health program. So, and then the other part, I'll go back to another one that I had heard, which was the telling where cattle come from. There is a big move for traceability, and really it's been the cattle industry that is ahead of the game on that, and that was really driven by BSE, or mad cow disease, a number of years ago, where cattle were moving back and forth across the border, especially with Canada and to some degree Mexico, and we had a different BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy program here than they did in Canada. We were a little bit more advanced. And we had to be able to track where cattle, we as a country had to be able to track where the cattle were coming from and that they were free of BSE, or we got dinged in the global TSC registry as high risk, low risk, and we didn't want to be a high risk food. People envisioned us being much like they did in Europe, where you had human mad cow disease cases that they, at one time, they were going to predict there were going to be hundreds of thousands of people that came down with CJD, the human form. That never, thankfully, ever happened. And even in this country, even though we had a few cases of cattle that came down with BSE, it was later learned that they all were imported from Canada. So we actually didn't have any native cattle. We're lucky. We only had, to my knowledge, one human case, and that was someone who had lived in England for a number of years, and that's probably where they acquired it there. So traceability is important. Now, that's also going to be a big part of the food safety laws. That's not been written in the regulations yet, but I don't know if you remember, a few years ago, there was a large outbreak of salmonellosis that was first traced to tomatoes, red round tomatoes. Absolutely, so what FDA went after the tomatoes, devastated that industry. And then after they did that, they realized, well, no, maybe it's peppers. And in fact, it was traced back, and it was jalapeno and serrano peppers. Well, by that time, the damage to the tomato industry was irreversible, and those people got hurt. So because of that, there is a real drive for traceability in all kinds of food, all kinds of ingredients, and that will be part of the law. Now, what other questions did we miss?
Horse food.
Oh, horse meat.
Horse meat. Yeah.
Horse meat. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, that's not really a food safety issue. That's a yuck factor issue, where some populations eat horse meat, and that's fine. But it's really the animal rights advocates in this country say we don't want to be part of that business, and so we'll see what happens.
You have time for one more question.
Gene, is GMO an issue or a non-issue? And is there any regulatory machinery in place to regulate, monitor, otherwise at the government level involved in this country?
There is, and in fact, but it's a voluntary system where if you want to be certified is not the right word, recognized, it has to go through an evaluation procedure by USDA for exotic diseases, for instance, for animal and plant health. It goes through FDA for food safety, and it goes through EPA to make sure that there's no unintentional environmental damage of having the gene product that has been introduced. This has been studied by virtually all of the recognized scientific panels, and it doesn't appear to be a food safety issue. Now, where it has really become an important issue is that some consumers just say, I don't want it, and there's no way I can tell whether it has it or not. So it has become a big issue in terms of consumer right to know, and it's pushing towards labeling. The problem and sort of the slippery slope with labeling is if it's not a science and it's not identified as a health issue, why should it be forced to be put on the label? If we do that, what about animal rights? What about human rights? What about carbon footprint? Can all of that stuff be forced to put on the label too? So it's sort of an open question, but I think ultimately the consumers will win the day on this as well, and it will end up being labeled. Many companies are voluntarily labeling already.
For taking the time, and thank IIT and the IFISH Institute. Thank you very much. It's been a fantastic evening. Thanks.
Good. Thank you.
What should you do if you get sick at a restaurant?